Welcome to TJC Talks. I'm Halise Lieberman, Director of the Toby Center for the Renewal of Jewish Life in Poland. I have the privilege to welcome all of you to what will be a very thoughtful, intriguing, perhaps provocative conversation between world-renowned Holocaust scholars, Professors Christopher Browning and Dariusz Stola. For those of you who are new, a very warm welcome. We hope that you will continue to join us throughout the rest of our programming, which will continue into 2021. So, welcome Professor Browning, welcome Professor Stola. We're extremely privileged to have you both with us. Without further ado, I turn the program over to you, Dariusz.
Thank you very much. It's really a very special pleasure for me to have this conversation with Professor Browning today, because I'm a great fan of his scholarship and himself personally. I still remember our first meeting in 1995 in New York. But the book we are going to start our conversation with today, the book which actually brought in a completely new field of research, which is the Perpetrator studies, was published almost 30 years ago in 1992. The Reserve Police Battalion 101 and the Final Solution in Poland is a relatively small book with a great impact. I think if we can compare the size of the book with the impact it has had, it would be really high on all the ranking lists. It's been translated into some 13 languages. And when I was trying to find out its impact, then I used my regular instrument, which is Google Scholar search engine. I read that it was cited more than 3,200 times. There are 3,200 references to it in various scholarly articles. And altogether, in Google, there are more than 500,000 returns when you Google with the title of this book. So it's really a small book with a great impact. And it reminds me immediately a beautiful sentence of one of the microhistorians, founders of the microhistory, that you can ask big questions in small places. And indeed, the place where the events described in this book happened is a small town in eastern Poland today, in the Lublin province, Józefów, near Biłgoraj. Really a small place, not known even by many Poles. So I would like to start our conversation with a question to you, Chris. What brought you to this small place?
Yes, thank you, Dariusz. I came on the topic while I was looking through all the indictments and verdicts relating to Nazi crimes in Poland from trials in Germany. I was at the Central Agency for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes in Ludwigsburg, just trying to fill in the gap about what happened in Poland, because half the victims of the Holocaust, of course, are Polish Jews, but nothing like half the documents we have relate to Poland. So there's so much we didn't know about the Holocaust in Poland. And one way I was trying to fill in was through the German court investigations that took place in the 1960s and 70s. And when I came across the indictment, Reserve Police Battalion 101, two things leapt out. One was the testimony about Major Tropp offering his men the opportunity to step out and not take part in the killing in the first massacre at Józefów on July 13, 1942. Making very explicit the issue of choice. I'd always been looking in my previous research into perpetrators, what choices they had, why and how did they make these choices. So I was interested in choice, but I'd never seen it framed so absolutely graphically, as on the eve of a massacre, a commander saying, you can shoot or you don't have to shoot. I'd never seen anything like this in what was then close to 20 years of Holocaust research. And the second thing that leapt out was that the various quotes of the policemen's testimonies, unlike so many, which were obviously mendacious, obviously denial and whitewashing, these had vivid, horrific, graphic descriptions of what the men did. They had a ring of authenticity and truth that was just stunning in comparison to the normal pile of lies one found in much of the German court records, in which the defendants simply lied for each other and denied everything. So I resolved to go to Hamburg and look at the case itself, and that's when I discovered that over 200 men from the battalion had been interrogated because the roster had survived. This is the first roster of a killing unit that we had found, and that the interrogators could get over 40% of the unit and to question them in 1962 and carry out a very thorough investigation. And most of them were rank and file. The officers would lie for one another, but the rank and file didn't want to cover for their officers, many of them who didn't like them, and would tell what the battalion did in a very truthful way. So that's what sort of was the origins of the book, why I came to that topic. I'd always been looking at perpetrators, but never at the actual grassroots shooters, we might say, the grassroots killers, until this opportunity fell into my lap when I got the lead to the battalion in Ludwigsburg and went up to Hamburg to look at the entire court record.
So it was not the place, but the sources that you found, the exceptionally rich sources that brought you to
Yes, it was coming across a lead to these this unique collection of sources, this over 200 testimonies from a single killing unit, that was absolutely crucial to this. And then, of course, as I was working on the book, the day at Józefów, what happened in that village, becomes, in a sense, the pivotal point of the narrative, because that's when Trop first offers to the men they don't have to kill. And that remains the operating procedure of the battalion thereafter, and how that plays out, how the battalion, in a sense, gradually divides into men who learn to enjoy killing other human beings, who I call the eager killers, men who would kill when they were asked but didn't seek opportunity to do so, and men who either in the first day or thereafter at some point took up the major's offer and became what I call the evaders, people who would participate in ghetto clearings and in cordons around shooting sites, but wouldn't actually kill themselves, wouldn't fire their rifle and shoot another human being directly, even if they continued to do the other kinds of supportive activities of the battalion that enabled it to be a killing battalion.
Mm-hmm. Have you afterwards found another kind of the sources about another event so richly documented like the Józefów killing?
I don't think we found any killing unit with that depth of sources, and that's in a sense why Goldhagen came to it as well, because I think it is a kind of unique density or an unique intensity of sources for this particular unit. But of course, we now do have studied many other police units. We now have a comparative basis to compare 101 with other units. And of course, we've looked at the Einsatzgruppen. And particularly German scholars have studied various Einsatzgruppe A and Einsatzgruppe D, have very lengthy studies of each one. So that we've done a fair amount now about individual killing units. But in terms of the actual voices of the men in the unit, I think this collection of testimonies for 101 still remains the single best source we have on getting into the experiential side, recreating the experiences of the men themselves.
What made them so sincere in the testimonies comparing to other perpetrators?
Well, at least initially, the men who were conducting the investigation were a special commission, because when they went up to investigate, they found many of the people who would normally conduct the investigation, police investigators, were men who had been in 101 or new people in 101. So they had to create an outside investigation. So they had a number of very able people who did this and were committed to doing it. Not all German investigators were committed to what they were doing, but this was a group that was very committed, very conscientious, and very able. And they more or less assured the rank and file that they were after the officers. In a sense, they said, nothing will happen to you even if you confess to what you did. Mm-hmm. And indeed, none of the rank and file received any prison sentence. Some of them were convicted, but the judge then exercised discretion not to impose any punishment. So I think he could get a large number to talk, one, because they were told there would be no judicial consequences, but in America we call a plea bargain. And that they were very skillful, and that many of the men did not like their officers. So many of the trials, we knew the officers, they lied for one another, but the men weren't willing to lie for their officers and often were quite willing to say bad things about them. So I think all of that came together to create this very unique perspective or very unique group of sources that could get us inside the unit.
Mm-hmm. You've mentioned Daniel Goldhagen's book and The Ordinary Germans, clearly a reply to the title of your book. His book began the best known, the biggest debate following your book, but not the only one. There were several of them. For example, in a Polish case, the famous book by Jan Tomasz Gross, The Neighbors, on the killing of Jews in Jedwabne by their Christian Polish neighbors, is also clearly, it in some ways follows your example by focusing on a single event in a small town with a very different group of perpetrators. So out of these many debates, which one you see now from a perspective as contributing most or bringing the most novel perspectives of what you had known before?
I would say for me, the most constructive criticism, the one that I have found most useful in how I proceeded, was that of not a historian, but a social psychologist, Leonard Newman. And he was replying to Goldhagen's criticism of using social psychology. But it also was a answer that I thought was very illuminating and useful for all historians who are working in this field. When Goldhagen criticized my book and became the chief critic, it meant that we were assigned sort of binary opposite positions. His was then viewed as the ideological, cultural explanation, and mine was the situational, institutional explanation, and I was accused of ignoring ideology. Mm-hmm. Well, certainly he emphasizes ideology much more than I do. I don't think I said ideology didn't count. I tried to present what I thought was a multi-causal explanation, but certainly in weight of emphasis. And his position, in a sense, got me positioned as being the one defending a kind of strictly situational, organizational, institutional response. And what Newman argued was that is a false dichotomy. That is, when men find themselves in a situation, they are going to read that situation through the cultural lenses, that the glasses they're wearing. There's no such thing as a tabula rasa situation that everybody in it will see in the same way. And so while the situational factors I talked about were very important, people who are brought to that kind of situation will understand their situation, read their situation, construct their situation, depending upon the assumptions and the values and the perspectives they bring with them. So they can't possibly do what they're doing in Poland strictly as a response to situation. Their German cultural attitudes have to be included as well. And so how we balance those and how we try to sort out how much of what these men were doing were responding to what I would consider more universal aspects of human nature: deference to authority, conformity, role adaptation. How much to more German cultural factors that shaped the way in which they understood the situation they were in. A more militarized society where putting on a uniform has greater weight than in some other societies, so that role adaptation weighs heavier. Mm-hmm. In a society that's totally anti-military, obviously putting somebody in a uniform creates a different situation than one in Germany, where putting on a uniform really helps significantly shape how you think who you are and what you're doing, and legitimizes, in a sense, behavior that you do wearing a uniform that you would never consider possible if you were a civilian. So I thought that was very useful, and perhaps the most constructive kind of criticism towards the way that argument between me and Goldhagen had developed, and one that I've tried to absorb. I think a second one related to methodology. How do we use these testimonies? All historical evidence is problematic. I mean, you can't just sort of accept it without thinking about what the nature of the sources are. If we use nothing but unproblematic evidence, historians couldn't write much history. So the issue is understanding what the problems are with the particular source we're looking at. And clearly, when you are dealing with post-war judicial testimony given 20 years after the event, you not only have problems of frailty of memory, amnesia, distortion, reinvention of one's past, which anybody interviewed 20 years after the fact is going to have, but we also have the judicial interference. These men are going to lie because they're afraid of incriminating themselves. So it's a doubly complicated kind of evidence to use. And so one of the real important disputes between me and Goldhagen was the methodological issue of how do we use this complicated evidence, which are post-war testimonies given in a judicial framework 20 years after the event that they're describing. Goldhagen's response was, I will use that testimony that has no potential to be self-exculpatory. I'll set a very high bar and use the pure testimonies that cannot be in any way considered potentially self-exculpatory. So I won't be duped I won't be taken in by any of the lies of these policemen. And he said very explicitly, I had not been careful enough. I had been duped. I had been suckered. I had taken in much too much of the false self-serving testimonies of the men. My counter to that was the following, that in fact, if you look at this testimony, there are kind of three bands. They're the testimonies that are obviously mendacious, that Goldhagen and I would look at this and neither of us would have any trouble throwing it out as obviously false. And they're the testimonies that are so self-incriminating that we would both use it, knowing that no one would say those things falsely to falsely self-incriminate themselves. But there's a whole band of middle testimony in which many of the policemen tell some of the truth some of the time, or even much of the truth much of the time, but not all of the truth all of the time, but is still so valuable because they're often not telling the truth about their own behavior, but still telling the truth about what the battalion did and what their comrades did and what their unit did. And to not use that testimony out of some sense of I only use pure evidence is, I think, a terrible mistake. And part of the reason we differed so much is that he used testimony that was guaranteed, in a sense, by being so selective, guaranteed to prove the thesis he was proposing. If your thesis is that the German killers were all committed hardcore Nazi anti-Semites, and they killed because they believed in what they were doing and wanted to do what they were doing, and then you say, I'm only going to take the testimony of those who admitted that they gave themselves heart, soul, and mind to Hitler, you can do no other than confirm the thesis that the evidence is supposed to test. You've screened out all the conflicting contrary evidence. And you can't arrive at any other conclusion. And what I think he did was to mistake the part for the whole. He looked at the eager killers, took their testimony, and then said that was everybody. But if you look at this broad band of middle testimony, you get a much more varied picture. And you get a much more nuanced picture. And you get a picture that includes all sorts of reactions and responses and choices of the men that covers an entire spectrum of behavior. And so I think that methodological difference between us could explain why we looked at the same sources and came to such utterly different conclusions. And I think my methodology was right and his was wrong. And of course, he's the opposite. But I do think we were part of our debate helped us to at least flesh out how we were using the evidence in such different ways that would, in effect, lead to such different and conflicting conclusions.
This is a beautiful example of the benefits of disagreement between scholars. So actually, we can sharpen our argument, we can make our understanding deeper. And when you are listening this subtle nuances of methodology of using documents relating to horrible crimes, I was thinking already about the debate we have had in Poland for now almost 20 years about the non-German perpetrators, Polish Christians, but in other countries of Eastern Europe, you have similar debates about Lithuanian or Ukrainian or Slovak or Hungarian, mostly men, who either as collaborators or on their own, as bandits, as killers, as blackmailers, somehow contributed to the Jewish tragedy. And we have really few sources And I cannot find a single source that could meet the high standards of Goldhagen that would be really completely reliable. Actually, most of them are testimonies given to the communist interrogators in the late 1940s, in very different circumstances. But my question is, to what extent do you believe that your findings, that your way of thinking about it applies to those people who are not in uniforms, who are not drafted to any army, who are in a way self-selected, either as collaborators or as bandits? To what extent we can use your insights to better understand crimes committed against the Jews, but not ordinary Germans, not any Germans at all, but other East Europeans?
Yeah. For my own work, of course, I had within the battalion a group of people from Luxembourg. So these were Luxembourg policemen drafted into the order police after Luxembourg was annexed to Germany. So they are not products of German culture, but come out of a very different background. And it would seem, at least, several things. One, many of the Luxembourg police refused to serve, and they paid a penalty for that. They wouldn't become part of the police of a conquering power. But many others then volunteered to take the spots that had become open in the Luxembourg police, which they had wanted to get, but there was no chance because it was a limited number. Now, with these openings, a lot of people volunteered and eagerly joined, so that you have a degree of voluntarism as well as a greater degree of coercion. That is, there was greater penalties if you left, but there were opportunities that allowed people to volunteer and join as well. And so I think that kind of paradox of both greater coercion on the one hand, but also greater opportunities of voluntarism on the other, characterize a lot of the European population in the choices they made to be accomplices alongside or collaborators with the Germans. In Eastern Europe, I think in particular, motives, for instance, of property, the chance to lay their hands on the property of their Jewish neighbors, was a factor greater than the Hamburg police. I don't think the Hamburg police particularly enriched themselves, but I think that was a major motive for many collaborators in, say, the Ukraine or Lithuania or Latvia. Certainly, the political dynamics of the prior Soviet occupation, and then at least Jan Gross has suggested some of them had to cover their tracks. That is, if they had compromised themselves earlier, the best insurance that you could take out was to now join the Germans in doing their worst dirty work, to make sure nobody could accuse you of past suspicious political, standing. So it was a kind of way of covering for past deeds that now suddenly had made you liable or vulnerable. So there's a lot of different factors at play for East European collaborators that weren't at play for the German policemen. Nonetheless, I think that it is still useful to look at the broader issue of not trying to read these people as individual sadists and individual psychopaths, but still looking at the issue of how ordinary people in Eastern Europe reacted to the series of events that take place between 39 and 41, 42 that lead them to becoming killers on behalf of Nazi Germany. It's certainly a different path than the German policemen. And as I say, I think there's maybe some more voluntarism and more coercion than you get with the case of the German police. But I still think we're talking about trying to explain people operating within a wider group dynamic. We're not simply looking at a collection of individual psychopathic serial killers. We are looking at a group dynamic of the village, of the auxiliary police units, the Schutzmannschaften that are being created, that will be crucial to understanding why they did what they did. In that sense, ordinary men would, in my book, would have a similar approach, but it is a different story, and it is different factors that are at play in terms of the auxiliary killers, the East European collaborators. But nonetheless, I think the approach in unpacking what that different situation is would still be valid.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that we can apply the same, I would say, the perspective of social psychology, not individual psychology, but very social psychology, situationist, also to the very different behavior, this behavior of helping the Jews or remaining passive in face of the tragedy? To what extent can we explain it as, I would say, a Christian, the expression of the Christian principles of helping thy neighbor who is in need, and to what extent you would explain it again as situational?
Yeah, certainly when I teach my course on the Holocaust, we focus first on sort of a history of anti-Semitism and then the rise of Nazi Germany and development of Nazi Jewish policy. But at the end, I go and take about 5 or 6 different countries in order to show that what happened in those countries does come out of the indigenous history of that country in interaction with Nazi domination of Europe. So that the way in which the French and Vichy regime behaves, the way in which the Romanians behave, the way in which the Danes behaved, has to be understood in terms of the particular histories and situations of each of those countries. So we have, in a sense, a number of different histories of the each country has its own unique Holocaust history, we might say, within the wider European-wide phenomenon, in which Germany is a major factor, but the indigenous elements all have to be taken into account in each geographical location. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, I think we do have to remember, in a sense, we're trying to get this balance between what you might say are the European-wide factors, what are the German factors, and what are the local factors. And all of those are going to be present. And the question is, what balance do we get there? And of course, the issue also is of what sources do we have? We have sources for the Germans for their policy making and their reports. They're bureaucratic and they keep records. The problem with looking at East European collaborators is we have so many fewer sources. It's not nearly going to be documented as well. And then we had a 40-year period in which you had some trials. Certainly the Soviets did try a number of people, particularly the Travnikis and others. Mm-hmm. But these had their own problems. And we couldn't even get at them, those sources, until much later. So the need is there, but I do think we have to look at each region in its own right, and at the same time as we try to fit it into the wider picture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like your presentation very much when you said that there are some pan-European factors like the Nazi policy in all of German-dominated Europe, although I must stress that there were important differences in the Nazi occupation policy, like very harsh punishment, including death penalty for any assistance extended to the Jews in Eastern Europe, like Poland or Ukraine, but not so much in occupied France or Netherlands. So the stakes were higher in a sense. But also, speaking about incentives, motivation to collaborate or to rob the Jews, a pair of shoes were a highly valuable thing in the winter of 1943. So there were people who were killed because of a pair of shoes.
Yeah, well, I think economic, material factors, the temptation to be a parasite or beneficiary of the persecution of the Jews for material benefit became stronger as you got into poorer and more impoverished areas. And as you say, you don't hear about killing for a pair of shoes in France, but it does happen in the Ukraine.
Yes, very much so. In addition to the social psychology of these perpetrators or auxiliaries, you have also the economy of collaboration, or the economy of betrayal, or the economy of helping the Jews. A very complex issue. How you can feed a family you hide in your barn when you have limited resources. And I think this is a future for the research, because we have seen really significant progress in this field of research in the last 20 years. primarily in Poland, but also in some other East European countries. But I see we have a lot of things to do in the future. And here I come to my next question, which is this field of perpetrator studies, in a way which you're the founding father of it, at least for European research. How do you see the future for it, or at least the future of the perpetrator studies for the World War II period? What are the topics, what are the methodologies you would advise younger scholars to take?
I would say the first change that has come on, one of the things that has developed, particularly after the Goldhagen-Browning debate kind of ended, and then where did people go from there, was to take a much wider look at German culture beyond the narrow focus on anti-Semitism. I mean, sort of the debate between Goldhagen and I was too narrowly focused on how anti-Semitic were the killers. Mm-hmm. And work by people like Thomas Kuhne, who were looking on other aspects of German culture that the Nazis could harness, could co-opt, and use for mobilizing people. And he first worked on the issues of comradeship and Volksgemeinschaft as being notions that had broad resonance in German society that could be weaponized by the Nazi regime so effectively that are not so narrowly focused on an anti-Semitism, but in fact are broader and help to explain a whole wider degree to which you could create a criminal regime that got so much of the German population actively supporting these policies that went well beyond just the murder of Jews. I mean, we know, for instance, the Generalplan Ost was planning all sorts of, that there were 30 to 40 million too many Slavs that were going to have to disappear, that the killing the Jews was round one, but that there was much that was going to follow. So I think in that sense, getting a broader sense of the regime's ability to mobilize ordinary Germans for criminal activities while having them not being, to use Goldhagen's term, not because they wanted to do it, but were nonetheless willing to do it without thinking of themselves as being criminal. Mm-hmm. That I think in this regard, Helmut Walzer, with his work on Reserve Police Battalion 45, Thomas Kuhne with his work on Volksgemeinschaft and comradeship, have been, for me, I think the cutting edge where I think things are going, and where I would see, at least in terms of this grassroots perpetrators, where the most advanced, most progress I think has been made.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'm glad you mentioned the Slavic targets of the Nazi policies, because actually the first multi-million group of victims of Germany horror were the Soviet prisoners of war. So even before the gas chamber started to operate, 2 to 2.5 million Soviet prisoners of war were starved to death.
Yes. Yeah. If Hitler had been assassinated in the spring of 1942, the greatest crime of the Nazi regime would have been the murder of 2 million Soviet POWs in the first 9 months of the war. It is with the beginning of the clearing of the Polish ghettos that the number of Jewish victims then, of course, in the terrible year of 42, exponentially passes that of any other victim group under the Nazis. But up until 42, the Jews were not the singular victim or even the most numerous.
Mm-hmm. Do you see that there was a relation between these other crimes? Like you have written about the role of the so-called euthanasia program in preparation of the final solution. And now we have mentioned the fate of Soviet prisoners of war. Do you see a causal relation between these crimes and the final solution? I mean, the Holocaust?
I would say we see this in several ways. Certainly, say between the euthanasia or T4 program, of course, you have the technology, the use of carbon monoxide gas shifted from there. The personnel is shifted, and so that you've got a very direct kind of connection there. Mm-hmm. I think also important is in a sense, the crusade against Bolshevism, the crusade against seeing this as not both a race war and an ideological war.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, one of the areas where I was working in was the Nazi occupation of Yugoslavia,
Mm-hmm.
and what happened in the fall of 1941 in Serbia, where once the communists were no longer, in a sense, hindered by the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, and then become ordered by Stalin to raise as much resistance behind the lines, after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, the uprising in Serbia begins primarily, not exclusively, but primarily as a communist partisan group, and then others come in.
Mm-hmm.
But the initial response of the German occupiers is, of course, to carry out these terrible reprisal policies where they liquidate 100, they kill 100 Serbs for every German killed by the partisans. So you have German units, before they even start shooting Jews, have gone into a town like Kragujevac, rounded up all the high school students, and murdered hundreds of school kids. They find out that when you shoot Serbs, many of them then flee to the forest and join the partisans. So they then switched to shooting Jews who had been in camps and have the perfect alibi. The one group in Serbia that could never have been involved in the uprising were Jews because they'd already been interned. But they have to fill the quotas. But we have this remarkable quote from the commander of the German army there, where when he's ordering these initial punitive expeditions to punish the entire population, as he puts it, for the uprising, before they begin shooting Jews, you must shoot everybody, but the whole population must suffer to pay for this. And then he says, anyone who has, in a sense, false humanitarian inhibitions sins against the life of his comrades. So what you've done is created an inverse moral world. If you don't go out and kill unarmed civilians, you are sinning against your comrade. The real sin is not shooting civilians, rather than the real sin being the murder of unarmed civilians. And you created this utterly upside-down moral universe in which basically only German life counts and nobody else's life has value, even before you started killing Jews. Then, of course, to take these people and turn them on to killing Jews instead of Serbs is no problem. You've already crossed the Rubicon. You've already crossed the threshold. But it's done, in the Soviet Union scene, it's done initially against POWs. In Serbia, it's done initially against all sorts of Serbs before they go on to exterminating the Jewish population. So these things are interrelated. And the ability to harness and get people to kill one group of innocent people opens the door for them, of course, then to be used to kill any other group as well.
Mm-hmm. You have mentioned several countries affected by this murderous policy. So, I would like to go back to my initial question, which was in a way geographic. When you have a look at the map of Europe during World War II, during the expansion of Nazi Germany, Hitler's domination in Europe, what would be the darkest place, the heart of darkness of Hitler's Europe? I have invented a measure for it, which is how many people per 1,000 of local populations were killed in a given province or county or a region. From your perspective, what would you look for the darkest place in Europe of that time?
Well, probably either northern Ukraine or Belarus, or at least eastern Poland, Belarus, northern Ukraine. I think it would be that area there where you had both, of course, all sorts of devastation from the fighting, but also devastating genocidal policies as well, and roundups of vast numbers of slave labor that are sent off to Germany. So vast enslavement, as well as, I forget, did Tim Snyder say that sort of 25% of the Belarusian population is dead by the end of the war? The figure in Serbia, I think, is not that high, but it's still alarmingly high, something like 15%, because they, of course, had a vicious partisan, many-sided civil war going on, of which the German occupation is part, but also a large amount of killing of one ethnic group against another, of course, in Serbia, Croatia. But certainly, I guess my feeling is that it would be in the Belarusian, Volhynian, Ukraine area that you probably get the highest death rates of total population.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I'm looking at my watch because I see that we have many questions coming from the audience. So maybe I will give 3 minutes of my time to this many people who would like to ask them. I see that we have people sending questions from all around the world, actually, from New Zealand to Canada, and of course from Europe. So maybe I will give back the floor to Elise, who has been reading this question.
Thank you, Dariusz. Thank you, Christopher. I don't even want to interrupt because all of us are actually glued to your conversation, and we don't want to end it. I think we've opened up many, many, many issues, and we can see from all of the incredible questions, the conversations that are going on among people on the chat we will happily share with you, because it's igniting both an intellectual and an emotional response from those of us who are sharing this program with you. So several of the questions which you alluded to, you addressed, you touched on, come from different people. As you pointed out, Dariusz, we have people from all over the world, and people asking questions from very different perspectives, very personal, perhaps more intellectual. And let me just start off with a comment and ask for one of you to respond. One of our participants wrote, "One of my young university students, let's say 20, 30 years ago, was shaken by Browning's book. He was in the Canadian Reserves, perhaps as a cadet, and he said he could see his unit acting like 101 for the sake of unit solidarity." How does solidarity apply here? You mentioned it, Christopher, in terms of how things move forward, or I shouldn't say forward, but move in these cataclysmic, terrible environments and terrifying environments. How might we respond to this young man or this gentleman who shared his
Well, I think what we find is virtually every military around the world knows that small unit cohesion and small unit loyalty is at the very center of the upholding the morale and the fighting efficiency of any military force, and that armies train this as part of the training of virtually every army. I'm very gratified that at all the military academies in the United States at one time or another have used ordinary men, so that they are conscious of the need of the officers that they're training, future officers, to be aware of what the dark side of that is. While small group cohesion and unit solidarity is essential for military effectiveness, one also must be aware of what abuse of that is possible, and what militaries have to, if they don't want to, in a sense, emulate 101, if they want to, have a professional army that still accepts old-fashioned notions of chivalry and honor and that sort of thing, that they have to be aware that they must counter that or balance that with making their men aware of such things as you don't have to follow criminal orders. In fact, you must not follow criminal orders, and to be aware that they still have to maintain what I would call their moral autonomy, even under military discipline.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Dariusz, did you want to speak to that?
I didn't hear you, please.
Dariusz, did you want to add something to Chris's comments?
When I was reading your book this almost 30 years ago, it reminded me about my own military service, because I did my military service back in communist Poland. I was drafted to the Polish army, and I remember exactly drafted. It was not a professional army. There was a compulsory military service for all young men, and I was watching how we were being trained to become killers, orderly killers, military, not shooting civilians, but it was exactly this direction. And it took our officers only a few weeks. We began with shooting at a very abstract round target, and a few weeks later we were using our Kalashnikovs to to fire at targets looking like human figures. And then you can automatize it. And then I realized it's not so difficult. Maybe not everybody. I suppose that some of my colleagues were not doing their best to really hit the target. But in massive armies, the armies of the industrial era, you don't need to make everyone into a killer. Just make a majority of the unit and then it works. And then you have this dynamics, which you have mentioned, that some people find a pleasure in it probably. And some others try to evade, but they're also useful because they can have these auxiliary roles like, clearing houses and doing things other than killing, which are nevertheless necessary. So I think I'm really glad that in the U.S. Army, in the U.S. academies, you have cadets reading your book. I wonder if in the Polish Army the officers do it as well. I would advise it very strongly, and especially as this is a part of Polish history. It happened in Poland, so it's not such a distant event. Far away from the United States, for example.
Thank you both. You give us much, I would say, food for thought as we think about it. And we come to a question which I think many of us who are educators, and whether it's on a university campus or in a community setting or a school, are asking ourselves, how do we transmit this using such extraordinary materials as your book, Chris, or the work that you've done, Dariusz? The question that keeps coming up and sort of comes around is the word relevance. And you're asked the following: is there a way you might suggest explaining this phenomena to young students such that it would seem relevant to them, and relevant being the operative word?
I guess I've never had students who didn't think it was relevant. But I will qualify that. My book was also used by a person in New Orleans who was working on reforming the New Orleans police. And she was running workshops, and so she used ordinary men. And she was telling me the story that some of the men came in and said, "Oh, it's a very good book, but what does Poland have to do with us?" They didn't see it as relevant to them. So, but for students to sign up for the course, I've never had them wonder about this, because really, the crucial question is that if you read the book and I think understand what it's saying, you're understanding that what it's saying is that people like us can do this under certain circumstances. It is not others and only others. It is not only abnormal people that can become killers. It is normal people, ordinary people that can become killers, and that is relevant to any ordinary person. And so I think that make sure that part of that aspect of the book is understood. And I haven't had trouble getting that conveyed.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Dariusz.
I was using Chris' book with my students, actually. And I had parallelly a class of Polish students and a class of foreign students. We had incoming foreign students in my college. And that was really interesting, because it was more among my Polish students that there was some resistance. That means the idea that, okay, after all, these were Germans, they invaded our country. Every child in Poland knows that Germans during the war behaved horribly. So it's not a surprise. So telling them, I was using the first person. Listen, when I say that these were ordinary people, I mean I could have been one of them, okay, under different circumstances. This is basically for me the message. And I was telling them how I was trained in the army to kill at targets looking like human beings. And first I resisted, but after like a couple of weeks, I was doing it, and I would say quite well. And then when you're in action, you don't have much time for thinking. So there is all this dynamics. And so initially there was some resistance, especially among my Polish students. But then when they got it, they really appreciated this insight. I think that realizing the capacity for evil in ourselves is one of the greatest discoveries that we can make. So after this initial reluctance, there was certain appreciation that I brought it to them. I see now among the questions a question which I would like to ask.
Please do.
I forgot to ask it. It's a question coming from Laurence Prompin about what these people did after the war. How did they come back to the civilian life in West Germany of the 50s and 60s?
That's a fascinating question, and it's one that's a bit hard to answer because, of course, the interrogators did not focus on or ask them directly about that. So it's only when occasional comments were made that seep into the record, in a sense, that I could get some take on that. My one question I always asked, did these men have post-traumatic stress syndrome? Did they have real psychological problems in the period after the war? And as far as I can tell, no. The men did not talk about having psychological problems after the war, in part because virtually all the men coming back were coming back from the military service of some kind. Virtually all of them had witnessed terrible things. Virtually everybody in Germany was not asking them what they did, but was helping them to forget. They were all framing themselves as the victims. We're the victims of the Red Army and the rapes. We're the victims of the bombing. We were the victims of the Nazi dictatorship. We were the victims of everything, so we can't be perpetrators if we're victims. Mm-hmm. And so everybody agreed in a kind of collective amnesia and a kind of collective exculpation. Several things became apparent when they had to come back and talk about this in 1962. For many of the men, this is the first time they had thought about it in years. I remember one man's comment. He says, now that I'm coming in every day and being interrogated about this, for the first time, I'm having nightmares. Now I am having nightmares. There'd been a collective amnesia about this, and the society had supported a collective amnesia. But when he's forced to come in and remember and talk, then suddenly all of this comes up, and for the first time, he's having nightmares about what he had done 20 years ago. I think the second thing that was very prevalent in the tone of the interrogations is not a tone of remorse, not a tone of guilt, but overall, above all, a tone of self-pity. That in 1942, they were drafted and given the dirtiest job to do, poor them. Mm-hmm. And 20 years later, somebody has changed the rules and is now interrogating them as potential criminals, doubly poor them. What a bad deal they got in life. Not a word about the victims, not at all any identification with the victims and the people to whom they did things, but a sense that they are really unlucky, that they had such a bad draw of the cards in life to have been sent to Poland to do this in 1942 and then to be punished for it in 1960s.
So I don't want to be the one to bring this extraordinarily provocative conversation to an end. Chris and Dariusz, you've brought us to a new space. I think certainly pulled us back into questions that we thought we answered or thought we had addressed. And I really want, on behalf of Toby Jewish Heritage Tours, Toby Center, and our talk program, to thank you both for this very stimulating conversation. Before we finish and say our final thank yous, I'd like to introduce very briefly the Chief Rabbi of Poland, Rabbi Michael Shudrick. Michael.
Thank you very much. Really, and thank you, Elise. Thank you, Christopher. Thank you, Dariusz. Fascinating. And Christopher and I have never met. We spoke briefly just before 8 o'clock. And I wanted to share with all of you something as a kind of is a follow-up to the work that Professor Browning has done, and kind of like a little bit the old Paul Harvey, the rest of the story. In the very back of Professor Browning's book, Appendix Table 1, is the number of Jews shot by Reserve Police Battalion 101. And there's a list of Yosefov, Omazu, Menzrit, Serokamla, Kotspachev, Konskavola, Międzyrzec, Łuków, Lublin District, Second Lublin District, Majdanek Poniatowy. We started work here through the Rabbinic Commission for Cemeteries and the Foundation of Memory, the Everlasting Memory, about 7 years ago, trying to find unidentified mass graves. And one of the first things that we had as a resource was your book, Professor Browning, and the appendix, which told us these are places where Jews were killed. And when we started looking into it, we discovered that basically none of them are commemorated. And we had to do research to find out where they, it's somewhere in Łomoza, but where in Łomoza? And since that time, we've slowly been able to do, we've done Łomoza, we've done a place called La Smugla, which is outside of Parchev. And for me, this is just unbelievable. We actually have put up, and I'm not real good at screen sharing, so I'm not going to try to do it to waste people's time. But we've now succeeded in doing in 2 places, and we fully intend to do in all the other places to identify really where the Jews are buried, to put up a proper matziva tombstone, and at least to give these victims of this horrible murder a proper grave 80 years later.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Rabbi Shudrick. So, again, Chris, Dariusz, thank you for opening up again this conversation, bringing it off of the bookshelf and into our reading space. You've given us a lot of thoughts to consider, a lot of issues that we as individuals and members of communities and members of societies and nations need to think about. I hope that we will have the honor and pleasure of hosting you both again, and you as well, Rabbi Shudrick, as we go through the conversations that deal with Polish Jewish history, Polish Jewish life, contemporary issues, and issues from around the global world that have an impact on how we see the Jewish legacy from Poland and contemporary life. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, dear audience, for spending the time with us. We hope that you've found this as provocative as we have, and hope that you will join us again. Just one word about our next event. Our next TJH Talk session will be on November 18th. Our guests will be filmmakers Agnieszka Holland and Roberta Grossman. And one last word on behalf of the team, who I want to thank very much for making this all happen and bringing it to you all around the world, is that we rely on your contributions and support and hope that you will help our program go forward. I hope you have a good rest of the week, and we will see you next month. Thank you. Dziękujemy bardzo.
Thank you.
Thank you.